welcome back to the next part of our series, We Are the Movement. Today we dive into Acts chapter 24 and we catch up again with the Apostle Paul. And as we do, let's take a moment to refamiliarize ourselves with his current situation. So Paul has returned to Jerusalem following his third missionary trip across Asia Minor, Macedonia and Greece, where he's revisited the fledgling churches in those areas, many of which he himself planted. And on his trip, he's gathered an offering to take back to Jerusalem to present to the church there to help them as they suffer in the aftermath of famine and under the weight of persecution. And when Paul returned to Jerusalem, it seems that the trouble he had hoped to have left behind on his journeys has pursued him to the holy city. And upon his entrance to the temple, a crowd of Jews from Asia accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple, a crime that would be punishable by death. These Jews from Asia have stirred up the crowd and surrounded Paul, and it was only the intervention of the Roman garrison that saved Paul's life. Despite Paul's subsequent attempts to explain to the crowd the real story of what he'd been doing, he ends up being escorted out of the city after a plot to kill him is uncovered. And he is taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea on the coast, some 60 miles away, and to the home of the Roman procurator at the time, a man named Marcus Antonius Felix. The year is now AD 57, and though he doesn't yet know how, Paul understands that God is working and maneuvering through the situation, and that Paul finds himself in right now to advance his kingdom and to position one of his most potent agents of heavenly change at the heart of the world's most powerful empire. For Paul, from this point on, all roads and sea lanes lead to Rome. But before he arrives in Rome, Paul must first face the prospect of a trial before Felix. His accusers, the Sanhedrin themselves, Jerusalem's most powerful and influential religious leaders, have made the journey down to Caesarea to confront Paul before the Roman governor. It seems, in this instance, history is set to repeat itself as the religious authorities bring their case to the Roman authorities to seek the death of a man who they believe is threatening everything their lives and power is built upon. Let's pick up the story now at the beginning of chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented the case before Felix. "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order to not weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He's the ringleader of a Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him." The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. So Ananias, the current high priest, with some of the elders and a lawyer, a man named Tertullus, make the trip to Caesarea, home of the Roman governors of Judea and a prominent Gentile city, to present their case before Felix. Now, this man Ananias is the current serving high priest, but he has nothing to do with another Ananias that we've met earlier in the book of Acts. And this Ananias has an ugly reputation. 5 years earlier, he had been reported by the governor of Syria for acts of violence and been sent to Rome to stand trial before the Emperor Claudius. Claudius had subsequently acquitted him, but it speaks to the character of the man. He was happy to use whatever means he deemed necessary to see his agenda advance. And he was said to have maintained very close ties with the Romans, being seen in the eyes of the Jewish people as a friend of the Romans, so much so that he would pay for that reputation with his life in the Jewish revolt of AD 66. He was a man who loved the power and the authority that his position afforded him. And once again, we see that as the movement advances and the kingdom of God begins to threaten the existing corrupt and unjust power structures of men and the powers behind those structures, there is an inevitable attempt by the enemy to push back against and an attempt to snuff out the movement. And to help with this, Ananias enlists the help of a lawyer named Tertullus. Now, we don't know much about him. Some scholars speculate he may have been a Gentile, but it's probably more likely he was a Hellenistic Jew. He was fluent in Greek and Latin, and he may even have made his case in Latin to further appeal to his Roman audience. And the other player on the stage at this point is the Roman governor or procurator himself, Marcus Antonius Felix. Now, Felix is an interesting character. He became ruler of Judea in AD 52, probably due to the influence of his brother, a man named Pallas, who fulfilled a position equivalent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer today for both the emperors Claudius and his successor, Nero. And the other interesting thing about him was that, unlike most Roman governors, Marcus Antonius Felix wasn't born into an upper-class family. He was actually a freedman. He'd formerly been a slave, along with his brother Pallas, to a woman called Antonia, the daughter of Mark Antony, the famous Roman general and lover of Cleopatra. And Antonia had also been the mother of the Emperor Felix, and it's to this association that Felix no doubt owed his appointment. Now, as we continue to read, we shall see more about this man Felix, and Luke will reveal more to us about his character. But the Roman historian Tacitus attributes this rather unfavourable assessment to Felix. He writes this: Felix exercised the power of a king with the mind of a slave. And it's this man who now holds Paul's fate in his hands, for the time being at least. And it's to this man that Tertullius opens up his case. Luke records the words for us, and before the accusations begin to be made, we see this almost sycophantic address by Tertullius to Felix. He tries to butter him up. He says, "Oh, most excellent Felix, we know you've done a wonderful job in this region." The truth is, Felix had done an awful job of keeping the peace, and the mistakes that he had made were laying the foundations for the Jewish revolt that would follow in just under 10 years' time. But Tertullius wasn't going to let something like the truth stand in his way. He goes on to make his accusation about Paul, saying that he's a troublemaker. He's a pest. He's like a plague going from city to city, stirring up insurrection among the Jews wherever he goes. We know, of course, that it was the Jews opposed to Paul who were the ones stirring up trouble. They were the ones who whipped up the crowds, and they tried to pin those riots and the unrest on Paul and his fellow ministers. And in this accusation, we can see the fingerprints of the enemy. Just enough truth sprinkled in among the lies. This is how he has operated from the very beginning. Satan is the father of lies, and he knows how to sell them. Mix them with just enough truth so that they become palatable, maybe even attractive. And as we look back at the events here, it's a good reminder to us that the enemy will still employ this same tactic. He will try to get us to swallow the lie by coating it in what looks like a truth. And that's why it's so important that we spend time with God, resting in his presence, soaking in his word, being led by the Spirit in conversation with him. Part of God's promises to us is that he will transform us through the renewing of our minds so that we may be able to discern his good, pleasing and perfect will, which includes being able to distinguish between the truth and a lie that has just enough truth about it to look like the real thing. You see, Satan is the master of the counterfeit, but God equips his sons and his daughters who invest in their relationship with him with the tools to be able to tell the difference between the work of the master forger and the masterwork of the Father. And as Tertullius continues to put the case to Felix, he calls Paul a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. And this is an interesting choice of phrase, because note that Tertullius doesn't refer to the movement as the Way, or even as Christians as they were already being called elsewhere, but he calls them a Nazarene sect. No doubt Tertullius was trying to draw a line between the Jews and Christianity. His choice of phrase was designed to put distance between the two, to delegitimize what Paul and his fellow believers thought. He is purposely trying to ensure there is no mention of Christians to avoid the obvious connection between Christ, which is the title for the Jewish Messiah, and what the Jews believed. After all, Paul and his fellow believers contended that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He is the one who would come to save and deliver not just Israel, but also the whole world. And Tertullius isn't going to legitimize those claims in the eyes of Felix though, through what for him would constitute a poor choice of words. And throughout his accusation, Tertullius has one aim. He wants to make this not just a Jewish issue, but a Roman issue. He knows that for the Romans to take action, especially against a man like Paul, who was a Roman citizen, they cannot bring a charge that is only an issue under Jewish law and not Roman law. And this again exactly mirrors what happened with Jesus. The religious leaders tried to do to him what they're now trying to do to Paul. They took their claim before Pontius Pilate. And notice Tertullius throws in this accusation that Paul desecrated the temple. No doubt a reference to the false charge that Paul had brought Trophimus, a Gentile, into the temple that was recorded for us in chapter 21. And we may be tempted to think that why would the Romans even care if the Jewish temple was desecrated? But Tertullius knew that everyone in the ancient world, Gentile, pagan, or otherwise, they all understood the seriousness of that action. It was not something done lightly, and it was something that would produce shock in anyone hearing such an accusation. And Tertullius is trying to stir up an emotional reaction in Felix. And then he invites him to investigate the matter for himself, while the other Jewish elders add their voices to these false accusations being levelled at Paul. And in doing so, they not only reveal their hearts further, but they break the law they professed so much to care about. Exodus 20 verse 16 says, "You shall not give false testimony against your neighbour." They violate a direct commandment from God to further their own agenda. And some of them may have fervently and genuinely believed that they were doing the right thing in God's eyes by bringing a man they considered to be a threat to God's intentions before the authorities. But if we feel we have to compromise on God's instructions for us to achieve something for him, then we are deluding ourselves. God is big enough to stand up for himself. He's powerful enough to see his purpose come to pass with or without us. If we feel we have to compromise on what God has said to achieve something for him, then we're placing ourselves above God, saying not only do we know better than him, but also that we are more important than he is. In everything we do, even those things that we feel passionate about, that we honestly believe to be right and sincere, we would do well to examine our heart motivations, to ask, are we doing this for God, or are we really doing it for ourselves? Our foundations for life should be what God has already spoken through his word and revealed in his son Jesus to us. When we feel tempted to compromise on that foundation, we would do well to remember who God is and who he's created us to be. Let's return now to the courtroom, because Felix, having heard the accusations of the Sanhedrin and their lawyer, gives Paul an opportunity to respond. And we'll read now from verse 10 through to verse 21. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or those who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was the one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence, it is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." Paul opens up his defense by simply stating the truth. Always a good way to begin. And he says that there are lots of people who can witness to the fact that he'd only been in Jerusalem for 12 days. Men like Luke, who'd travelled with him from Asia. Men like Manasseh, who'd housed him on his journey. Men like James, who'd welcomed him into Jerusalem. In fact, Paul could even point out people in the very city he was currently being held in Caesarea, who less than 30 days ago welcomed him through there. People like Philip and his 4 daughters. And he goes on to refute the claim of his accusers. He'd been in the temple simply to observe the proper custom, to give notice of the end of the vow the 4 men he was sponsoring had undertaken. He wasn't making any trouble, and he picks up on the most obvious weakness in the accusation made against him. Where's the proof? Where are the witnesses to corroborate these charges? There are none. Paul then launches into reconnecting in Felix's mind that which Tertullius has tried so hard to disconnect. He says, I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. He says, I believe everything they do about the law and what is written in the prophets. I have the same hope in the resurrection that these men have. In fact, Paul probably had more hope because he'd already seen the resurrection. He had seen the risen Jesus, the first fruits as he calls them in his first letter to the Corinthian church. Of course, for Paul, the law and the prophets found their fulfillment in Jesus. But these, in his eyes, only made them more beautiful as they pointed forward to the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises to all people. Paul then goes on to make mention of his long absence from Jerusalem and reference to part of the reason why he's now returned. He mentions the offering that he's collected from the churches around Asia, Macedonia, and Greece. And at this point, we may very well assume that Felix's ears prick up, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But Paul goes on to reiterate that when he was in the temple, he did nothing wrong. He was ceremonially clean. Luke records for us in chapter 21, verse 24, that Paul joined the 4 men he was sponsoring in their purification rite. So he was ceremonially clean. Paul goes on to say that there was no one with me, a direct refutation of the charge of desecrating the temple by bringing in a Gentile into the court of the Jews. And at this point, Paul goes on the attack. He knew full well who is behind this, having been hounded by this same group of Jews throughout Asia on his travels. He says they should have been the ones here bringing this charge because it was them who stirred up the crowd, just as they did in places like Ephesus and Pisidian Antioch. But in their absence, Paul lays down a challenge to the members of the Sanhedrin who have come. He challenges them to bring a specific charge against him rather than some general slanderous accusation. Paul knows they have no witnesses. They have no hard evidence against him. And then he goes on in a somewhat sarcastic tone to say, or maybe it's because I said in your presence that it's because of the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. Once again, turning to that divisive issue that played both sides of the Sanhedrin off against one another, Sadducee set against Pharisee. All in all, I think it's fair to say that Paul's defense wipes the floor with the baseless accusations of the Sanhedrin. There's no evidence to convict Paul, no witnesses that have been produced. For Felix, it's one man's word against another, but as we'll see, he has other motivations for what happens next. So, let's keep reading now from verse 22. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. So Felix adjourned the meeting, saying he was going to wait for the Roman commander Claudius Lysias, the man who had broken up the ugly scene outside the temple, to come and share his account. Felix ordered Paul to be kept under guard, but we're told here that he had some freedom and could receive visits from friends to take care of his needs. Effectively, Paul's placed under house arrest, but Rome isn't going to pay for this. Paul would have to provide for himself. That's why Luke records that Paul was allowed to receive friends to take care of his needs. Among other things, these friends had to provide the means for Paul to live during his captivity. Interestingly, Paul records for us the fact that Felix was well acquainted with the way. Now, some scholars debate the translation of the text here. Some say that how this should really read is that Felix adjourns the trial so that he can become more acquainted with the way. But the majority believe that this is a statement about Felix, that at least compared to the average Roman, he was already well acquainted with the way. Indeed, the evidence that we have would seem to suggest that Felix had every reason to already be familiar with the Christians in Judea. He'd been governor of the province for around 5 years at this point, and his headquarters in Caesarea was the site of much Christian activity and was the home of one of the most prominent members of the early church, Philip the evangelist. Not only this, but as Luke goes on to mention, Felix's wife, Drusilla, was actually a Jew too. Now, Drusilla was Felix's third wife. She was only young at the time, around 22 years old, but she had already been previously married, but had gotten a divorce from her previous husband. In fact, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus points to Felix's involvement in that divorce, saying that he engaged the services of a magician, a man named Atomos, to expedite that divorce. And history records for us that Felix and Drusilla had at least 2 children, and one of them, a son named Marcus Antonius Agrippa, was actually one of the Romans who died at Pompeii when the Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Now, Drusilla herself was from no ordinary background. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa, who we've met earlier in Acts 12, he who was proclaimed a god, and because he took the glory for himself, instead of redirecting it to the true God, paid the price. And she was also the sister of Herod Agrippa II and Bernice, who we'll meet shortly as we continue our journey through the book of Acts. She was said to be exceedingly beautiful, no doubt the reason why Felix had used any means at his disposal to secure her for himself. And as a Jew, Drusilla would have been familiar with the goings-on in and around Judea. She may well have been able to share her knowledge of the way with her husband. And it's before this pair, Felix and Drusilla, that Paul now appears several days after the adjournment of the meeting with the Sanhedrin. Now, presumably at some point here, Claudius Lysias, the Roman commander who had come and talked with Felix, but Luke records nothing from that meeting. If it did happen, then Felix either didn't get any further answers or preferred to not rock the boat and keep Paul in his current situation. But as Paul is brought before Felix and Drusilla, we yet again see that he takes the opportunity to talk about God. He was definitely one of those who always stood ready to give an answer for the hope that he had. Paul's subject matter, however, is very interesting, and it reveals to us more fully the character of this man Felix that he is standing before. Luke records for us that as Paul spoke, he talked of righteousness, self-control, and judgment, and on hearing these things, Felix became afraid. You see, as a Roman official, someone with power and influence, Felix was conditioned to see Roman justice and Roman judgment as the ultimate justice and judgment. In Felix's world, power was righteousness, might made right, and the Roman Empire stood head and shoulders above all others. Felix was more concerned with self-indulgence than self-control, something revealed to us by the fact that he hoped to extract a bribe from Paul for his release. No doubt because Paul had told him previously that he had brought a financial gift with him to Jerusalem. Felix probably hoped Paul would be able to access more funds to gain his release. Clearly, as Paul touches on these subjects that went to the very heart of the character of Felix, what Felix feels is a conviction of sin. He's confronted with the reality of his life in the light of the standard that God requires. But Felix, instead of embracing the message, instead of asking, is there a way to deal with this sin, he retreats back into his fear and into his comfortable life, ignoring the feeling in his soul that things are not right in his life. He says to Paul, enough. When it's convenient for me, I'll send for you again. And though he frequently heard Paul talk, he did it not because he wanted to hear more of the message, but because he was seeking a bribe. His heart had been hardened and calloused, and he willfully turned his back on the message that God was delivering to him through Paul. And this is a great reminder to us all. Felix wanted things on his own terms, at his own convenience, in his own time. But with God, we don't get that luxury. Time and time again, we're told in the Bible that God works things according to his purpose, in his time, for his glory, and not ours. And when God convicts us of sin, the purpose of that is to drive us to him, not back into our sin. But it's up to us to choose how to react. Felix reacted by running away. He let fear drive him away from God, and Felix went back to worshipping his true God. He worshipped himself. As we finish out the chapter, we see that not only did Felix not respond to Paul's message, but that Paul suffered too because of his decision. Let's read the final verse, verse 27. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So 2 years passed. 2 whole years where Paul is kept under house arrest, going back and forth with Felix but not getting anywhere. It would appear then for Paul this is very much a case of justice delayed being justice denied. Now, we're not told what else Paul did for these 2 years. We know enough about Paul's character that we must have spent much of the time in prayer. No doubt he meditated on the words that Jesus had spoken to him that night in the barracks at the fortress of Antonia in Jerusalem. Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. He must also have spent time with those of his friends who were allowed to come and visit him. And this may have been the time where Luke, the author of Acts, gathered much of the information he details from Paul about his earlier journeys. No doubt Paul also took every opportunity to speak with his captors, as he would do with those who would come to hold him in Rome. Perhaps he also penned some of his letters from this location, though there's no conclusive evidence to tie any of them to this particular imprisonment. This must have been for Paul a very frustrating time in a lot of senses, but from what we know about him, though it was frustrating, it was anything but fruitless. There may have been occasions in your life where you feel that you're in a moment of frustration, where you may feel that your destiny with God is on hold, or perhaps might never come to pass, as Paul may have been tempted to think also. But with God, a delay is not the same as a denial. He does all things well, according to his timeline and not ours. When we find ourselves in situations where we have to wait on God, we would do well to remember the words of the prophet Isaiah. Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. While we are waiting on God, God is working on us. And times of waiting produce patience and perseverance, endurance and character. They lead us to a place that reminds us that our identity is never based on what we can do for God, but on what he has already done for us through Jesus. And as Paul is waiting, there's a change in the Roman governorship. Felix is recalled to Rome in AD 59. This happens because Felix has done a poor job of managing the region, and there have been uprising among the Jews, particularly in Caesarea, where Felix has sent Roman troops in to deal with a dispute between Jews and Gentiles, and seemingly those troops have heavily favoured the Gentiles. And we're told that as a parting gift to the Jews, probably to try and get back in their good graces and to mitigate the bad report he was returning to Rome with, he leaves Paul in prison. And with his parting action, Felix demonstrates that even after 2 years of personal sermons by the Apostle Paul, he was still out for himself, still putting himself first, still worshipping himself. And it's a reminder to us that we can share the message, we can pray for others, we can contend for others, but none of us, not even the Apostle Paul, have the power to bring people to salvation. That is the work of the Holy Spirit in them. partnering with their will to allow them to accept the grace gift of salvation through faith in Jesus. And there's a parallel again with the story of Jesus here. In John 19 verse 12, we're told that Pilate was encouraged to not release Jesus if he wanted to be thought of as a friend to the Jews. And it's a parallel that some of us may experience too in our own lives, whether it's directly or indirectly, explicitly or subtly, and whether it's from family, members, co-workers, friends or fellow students, we can all at times feel the pressure to choose between Jesus and other people. And it's up to us to make the choice. But we do so knowing that while we were still sinners, Jesus chose us. He chose to endure the pain of a method of execution so brutal it gave birth to a whole new word that classified that pain. And he did it because he looked forward to the other side of the cross and judged the cost a price worth paying. And he did it for you and me, and he did it for them. And for now, Paul must wait as the new governor, Porcius Festus, takes up his residence in his new province. For now, on the surface at least, the movement seems to have stalled, held captive under house arrest. If the enemy could not stop the movement, perhaps he hoped to contain it. In truth, as always, the enemy has overplayed his hand. The false accusations of the religious leaders have only succeeded in doing one thing: placing Paul in the very location that will see him arrive in Rome, the very place God has purposed him to go. And this is the most beautiful thing about the movement. Because while one man can be detained, delayed and denied, while you can frustrate the purposes of a person, the purpose of God can never be denied. What he has spoken will come to pass. His word never returns void. He has promised to build his church, and neither the schemes of the enemy, nor the power plays of man, nor the very gates of hell themselves can stop that project that God has proclaimed. Today, as we, together, through hundreds of thousands of individual moments, carry the movement forward and proclaim the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven, God's purpose is coming to pass. His word is being fulfilled and his church is being built. Though we may face periods of waiting, though we may face opposition and persecution and accusation, we never face them alone. Empowered by the Holy Spirit, God's movement continues to sweep the globe as the baton is passed from father to son and from mother to daughter. Today is our time to run, our time to rise. Our time has come because we are the movement and this is our moment. Let's make the most of it.